Sun Fang Massacre. Imagine a soldier getting sentenced to life in prison for murdering women and children, but then serving less than a year because a general decided to let him go early. This is the story of the Su Nang Massacre, which took place in Vietnam on February 19, 1970. Tensions were high because a week earlier, a Viet Cong ambush had killed 9 U.S. Marines. To get revenge, a lieutenant sent out 5 soldiers, ordering them to avenge the Marines' deaths. They went to a hamlet called Sun, which was about 2 km from their base, and when they arrived, they found 3 small huts. The soldiers ordered the people inside to come out. The inhabitants were just women and young children. Nonetheless, their team leader ordered them to shoot, and they killed everyone. They went to a second hut and did the same thing, then moved to a third hut and killed the people there too. In total, they killed 7 women and 9 children. When the team got back to base, they lied and reported that they had been in a firefight with 15 to 20 Viet Cong soldiers. However, the next morning, Vietnamese civilians told another Marine patrol what happened, and they found the bodies. The truth came out and charges were brought against the Marines. One member of the team agreed to help the prosecution. During the trials, the leader and another soldier were acquitted, but a soldier named Schwartz was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to life in prison with hard labor. Another one called Green was found guilty of unpremeditated murder and sentenced to 5 years. He himself was surprised by how short his sentence was and even asked 5 years for that. However, they did not even serve that much time. Major General Charles F. Whiteack reduced both sentences to less than 1 year, and they were released in 1971. Green eventually himself in 1975, while Herod wrote a book about the event and lived until 2017. Raid on Catawba. A family was celebrating the birth of a newborn baby when American soldiers burst in and opened fire, killing 7 people, including 2 pregnant women. This happened on February 12, 2010, in the village of Catawba, Afghanistan. A family had gathered at the home of a police officer named Mohammed Dawood Sharabuddin to celebrate the naming of his son. The family was not associated with the Taliban. In fact, Dow was a police commander who had been trained by the Americans. Around 3:30 in the morning, Dow and his 15-year-old son went outside to investigate noises and were immediately shot by snipers. The rest of the family rushed out in panic, and in the chaos, U.S. Army Rangers killed 5 civilians. The dead included 2 pregnant women and a teenage girl. Afterward, NATO released a story claiming that the soldiers had stumbled upon a gruesome scene where 3 women had been bound, gagged, and executed by family members in an honor killing. However, survivors told a very different story. They said they saw American soldiers using knives to dig bullets out of the women's bodies to hide the evidence. An investigation by a British reporter named Jerome Starkey forced the military to admit that the honor-killing story was false. Months later, Vice Admiral William McRaven visited the village to apologize and offer sheep as a traditional condolence. Despite this, an internal investigation concluded that the soldiers had followed the rules of engagement and none of them faced any disciplinary action. Thanh Phong Seals Massacre. Bob Kerrey was a man who served as a Navy SEAL in Vietnam and then became a U.S. Senator. In this story, when he started reading secret documents about his own past, his hands reportedly started shaking. In early 1969, he led a commando team known as Cars Raiders on a mission to a tiny peasant village called Thanh Phong in Vietnam. The village was considered a free fire zone, and their goal was to target a Viet Cong leader who intelligence suggested would be holding a meeting there. What happened that night became a dark secret that haunted Kerrey for more than 30 years. According to reports, shortly after midnight, the team killed at least 13 unarmed women and children. There are 2 very different stories about how this tragedy unfolded. Kerrey claimed that his team took fire from the village and shot back from a distance, only to discover later that they had killed civilians instead of soldiers. He described the horror of walking in and finding about 14 dead women and children when he expected to find armed guerrillas. However, a member of his team named Guard Clan tells a much more disturbing story. Clan claims that the team rounded up the civilians and decided to kill them all so they could not alert the enemy. And he stated that Kerrey gave the order to open fire. Survivors from the village also shared their accounts. A woman said she hid in a banana grove and watched the soldiers kill 5 civilians. Another survivor, who was 12 years old at the time, said 7 men entered a hut where 16 people were hiding. She said they used gunfire and an explosive device to kill the occupants, including 5 of her relatives, and she was the only one to survive. Years later, a museum in Vietnam displayed a drain pipe where 3 children reportedly hid before they were found and killed. In 2001, Carey finally addressed the incident publicly in a speech. He admitted that he used lethal procedures when there was doubt and acknowledged that he had ordered the operation, calling it a tragedy that he could never make peace with. Despite the civilian deaths, the unit filed a report at the time claiming they had killed 21 Viet Cong soldiers and captured weapons. Carey was even awarded a Bronze Star based on this false report. He later said, "Though it could be justified militarily, I could never make my own peace with what happened that night. I have been haunted by it for 32 years. Habula and Dilawir." In 2005, a massive 2,000-page government report was leaked to the New York Times revealing a pattern of torture and homicide inside a United States military prison in Afghanistan. This nightmare unfolded in December 2002 at the Bagram Theater internment facility. Inside those walls, 2 prisoners named Habula and Dilawir were beaten to death within a week of each other. Soldiers struck Habula repeatedly with what they called peroneal strikes, which are severe blows to the side of the leg above the knee that destroy the nerves. A few days later, Dilawir, a young taxi driver who weighed only 122 lbs, died as well. For days, guards chained him to the ceiling and pummeled his legs until they could no longer bend. When they hit him, he would cry out, "Allah," and the soldiers found this amusing. It became a running joke where troops would show up just to hit him and hear the noise. Over a 24-hour period, he was struck over 100 times. By the time a doctor finally saw him, he was dead. The abuse was so severe that medical examiners later said his legs looked like they had been run over by a bus. To make matters worse, investigators later learned that most interrogators believed Dilawir was actually an innocent man who simply drove his taxi past the base at the wrong time. Other prisoners suffered too, including a man named Haji Muman, who was shocked with electricity, and a female prisoner named Afia Siddiqui, known as Prisoner 650, who kept others awake with her haunting sobs. While 27 officers and soldiers were investigated, the punishments were considered by many as surprisingly light, with some serving only a few months in prison or receiving simple reprimands. Shinwar shooting. Imagine being stuck in a traffic jam on a busy highway when suddenly a car bomb explodes and the soldiers who were targeted start speeding down the road, firing machine guns at everyone in their way for miles. This terrifying scene is what witnesses describe happening on March 4, 2007 in the Shinwar district of Afghanistan. A minivan driven by a side bomber slammed into a U.S. Marine convoy, injuring 1 soldier. What happened next is disputed, but according to many Afghan witnesses and human rights groups, the Marines fled the scene while indiscriminately firing their weapons at passing civilians, vehicles, and pedestrians for anywhere between 6 to 16 miles. Initial reports claimed as many as 19 civilians were killed and around 50 were injured, including elderly men, women, and children. One local reporter said the Marines sprayed civilians with machine gun fire, even though they were not under attack. There were also reports that U.S. troops confiscated cameras from journalists and deleted photos, with one soldier allegedly telling a photographer, "Delete them or we will delete you." The U.S. military initially apologized, calling it a terrible mistake. However, a later inquiry by the Marine Corps cleared the soldiers of any criminal wrongdoing. The inquiry concluded that the Marines had come under a complex ambush and acted appropriately. It found that only 5 to 7 adult men were killed and claimed witness testimony was vague and contradictory. No criminal charges were ever brought against the officers involved. In fact, in 2019, a board recommended that the commander of the unit be retroactively promoted and given back pay, stating that the only mistake was senior leaders failing to stand by their troops. This decision angered Afghan officials and human rights organizations who felt that justice was never served for the victims of the shooting. The Bagaz strikes. Drone operators sitting in a base in Qatar watched in shock as American jets dropped bombs on a crowd of people they had identified as civilians. This happened on March 18, 2019 in Syria during a fight against the Islamic State known as the Battle of Busfakani. A secret American special operations unit called Talon Anvil called in an airstrike on a group of people near the Euphrates River. These people were mostly women and children trying to escape the fighting. Even though drone operators saw who they were, the unit ordered to drop a 500 lb bomb on the crowd. Then they dropped a second bomb that weighed 2,000 lbs on the survivors. The New York Times reported that 80 people were killed and 64 of them were civilians, which would make it one of the largest civilian casualty incidents of that war. The next day, observers saw piles of dead women and children, and the strike area was bulldozed shortly after. The U.S. military concealed this incident for years, and the official military count of civilian deaths for all of 2019 was only 22 and did not include this attack. Senior officials never reviewed the strike until the New York Times exposed it in November 2021. An Air Force legal officer named Dean Korsak said this could be a possible war crime. In May 2022, a U.S. military investigation concluded that the strike actually killed 52 enemy fighters and only 4 civilians, and said it did not violate the laws of war. Warwick-Nurk killings. In the spring of 2013, a shepherd was walking near an abandoned military base when he stumbled upon human remains, only to realize the ground around him was filled with the bodies of missing villagers. This happened in the Nurk district in Afghanistan. For months, local residents had been terrified because men were disappearing after being taken into custody by a U.S. Special Forces unit known as ODA 3124. In February 2013, the body of a man named Nazatullah was found with his throat slit after he had been arrested by U.S. forces. Tensions got so high that Afghan President Hamid Karzai demanded that U.S. forces leave the province. It was after the American unit withdrew in April that the shepherd found the remains near their former base perimeter. Villagers began to dig in the area and found bodies in 5 other locations nearby. Some bodies were intact while others were just parts, but they were identified as 10 men who had been captured by the Americans. In total, 18 men were killed during operations linked to this specific Special Forces team. Witnesses who had been detained by the unit told horrific stories of what happened inside the base. One former prisoner said he was held for 45 days and subjected to electric shocks, near drowning, and severe beatings. He even described being nearly buried alive. This witness claimed he saw an American soldier described as a big guy with a bushy red beard and green eyes beat a prisoner named Sayed Muhammad to death. Another detainee said he watched an Afghan interpreter execute a neighbor right in front of U.S. personnel who did nothing to stop him. When the bodies were first discovered, U.S. officials denied any American involvement and tried to place all the blame on the interpreter. However, the Red Cross provided new evidence, and Rolling Stone magazine published an investigation that forced the U.S. military to open a criminal inquiry. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have pointed out that despite abundant evidence of war crimes, the U.S. military justice system has a poor record of holding soldiers accountable. As of the time these reports were released, the families of the 18 murdered men were still waiting for justice. Marius Massacre. On January 23, 1870, an entire village woke up to the sound of barking dogs only to realize that soldiers had surrounded their camp in the freezing cold. This ended up in a massacre of people who were already sick and dying. This took place in Montana Territory. U.S. Army forces led by Major Eugene Baker were looking for a hostile band of pagan Blackfeet led by Mountain Chief. Instead, they found a camp led by Chief Heavy Runner, who had been promised protection by the U.S. government. Most of the men were out hunting, so the camp was filled with women, children, and elderly people, many of whom were suffering from smallpox. A scout named Joe Kipp recognized the camp and told Major Baker it was the wrong group. Baker replied that it made no difference and ordered his men to attack. He even threatened to shoot Kipp if he tried to warn the sleeping villagers. When the attack started, Chief Heavy Runner ran toward the soldiers, waving his safe conduct paper from the government, but he was immediately shot and killed. Soldiers fired into the lodges where people were sleeping, then charged in with axes and knives. Survivors described horrifying scenes. One woman remembered soldiers cutting holes in the lodges and shooting anyone who moved inside. Another saw them collapse, burning tents onto wounded people. In the end, approximately 200 Native people were killed. Despite the brutality, the government initially tried to cover it up, with Baker claiming most of the dead were warriors. However, reports from the Indian agent revealed the truth that most of the victims were women and children. This caused public outrage and forced President Ulysses Grant to shift toward a peace policy, ending discussions about giving the army control over Indian affairs. Young Holzhausen Massacre. On April 15, 1945, when the smoke cleared after a brutal battle, villagers went out to count the dead and they found 63 bodies, mostly teenage soldiers. But they noticed something really disturbing. They realized that the wounds on many of the men didn't happen during the fight. The U.S. Army was fighting against German combat engineers and a group of Waffen SS soldiers who were mostly just 17 years old. It turned out that between 13 and 30 of them were killed after they had already surrendered. Some estimates say the number could be as high as 48. One eyewitness watched as American soldiers used submachine guns to execute 4 SS troops during the night. For decades, this event was kept quiet and shrouded in silence. It was not until the 1990s that local German newspapers started reporting on what really happened. The United States Army Criminal Investigation Command finally launched an investigation in 1996 to look into the massacre. However, they were unable to identify the specific soldiers who committed the crimes. Shannon Massacre. One of the most famous American generals in history wrote a secret note in his diary, hoping to hide a mass murder committed by his own troops. But the truth eventually came out. A few weeks before January 1, 1945, German SS troops had slaughtered 84 American prisoners at Malm, so the situation was tense. Some units were issued orders that SS troops and paratroopers were not to be taken prisoner, but were to be shot on sight. In the village of Chenoine, the fighting was brutal, with the town changing hands 5 times and almost every house being destroyed. When the 11th Armored Division finally cleared the village, they found German soldiers hiding in cellars. About 20 of them were dragged out and shot immediately, even though they tried to surrender. The killing didn't stop there. An eyewitness watched as American troops marched another group of about 60 German prisoners up a hill. He saw machine guns being set up and realized the prisoners were going to be murdered. He later walked back down the road and saw lifeless bodies lying in the snow, noting that the Americans were committing the same crimes they accused the Germans and Japanese of doing. General Eisenhower heard about the killings and demanded a full investigation, but the officers of the 11th Armored Division refused to cooperate, claiming it was too late because the war was over. The general who wrote that diary entry was George S. Patton. On January 4th, he wrote that his men had murdered about 50 Germans and noted that he hoped they could conceal it. In the end, nobody was ever punished for the massacre. And a lawyer who served as a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials later looked at the files and said it smelled like a cover-up. Bismarck Sea Killings. In March 1943, thousands of Japanese sailors and soldiers were floating in the ocean after their ship sank, thinking the battle was over, only to see American planes and boats suddenly come back with unknown intentions. This happened during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. A large Japanese convoy was trying to transport thousands of troops to New Guinea to fight, but Allied forces intercepted them. In a short time, all 8 transport ships and 4 destroyers were sinking or destroyed. Usually, once a ship sinks, the battle for those sailors is considered over. However, this time, the Allied military leadership decided that wasn't enough. They justified their next actions by saying that if these men were rescued, they would just be landed at their destination and returned to fight immediately. There was also anger because Japanese pilots had shot at American airmen parachuting from their planes earlier in the fight. So, the order was given to destroy everything. That night, U.S. Navy PT boats went into the area and fired at rescue vessels and survivors in the dark. Then, when the sun came up, the planes returned. They shot at lifeboats, rafts, and even individual men swimming in the sea. The attacks were so intense that the water around the wreckage was filled with blood. The attacks on the helpless men went on for days. If you want to discuss this video or suggest an idea for the next one, join my Discord link in the description.